Hey there, fellow classic comic collectors and comic creators. As always, I'm Scott Harris King, and today I want to talk to you about something that's just hit the news that could potentially affect some of the stuff that I'm doing in comics. And that is, if you haven't heard about it, Bill Willingham, the creator of Fables, is having a big feud with DC, and I'm going to get all into that and how it's early days, but my early thoughts on the situation. So how does that affect me? Well, let me just set the table here. As you know, with the comics that I create, I use a lot of public domain characters, Golden Age characters in the public domain, or just public domain characters, sort of in general. So, for instance, in Cthulhu versus Uncle Sam, I use Uncle Sam, public domain character. I also use Granny Gumshoe, who is a Golden Age character from Quality Comics in the public domain. In my series, The Crimebusters, of course, one of the main characters is Crimebuster from the Boy Comics. So I like to use a lot of just cool Golden Age characters that inspire me. And of course, they have to be in the public domain. That's the key thing. I'm part of some groups online that are about, making comics with public domain characters and public domain superheroes. And I'm in some discords and stuff. And so it's something that I, talk about a fair amount here on my channel. I have some other videos about navigating, trademark and copyright usage of public domain, comic book characters and stuff like that. So the situation with Bill Willingham is very interesting to me. If you're not familiar with what's happening, Bill Willingham announced last week that he's having this big dispute with DC. Now, he has a creator-owned book, Fables, published through Vertigo, while Vertigo existed, and now I don't know, it's DC Black Label or whatever they're calling it these days. But basically, it's according to him and according to everything that I've heard in the past, Fables is a creator-owned book. So he has the rights to Fables, and then DC has the publishing rights. That's basically the deal they have. Well, he's put out this long screed, basically saying that DC has been actively trying to screw him over for years and years and years, and he's just basically sick of it. But he's bound by his contracts. He can't go to other publishers with it, and so he's kind of stuck. If he's going to do Fable stuff, he's going to do it at DC. So what he decided to do, to make a stand, I guess, is he issued a statement saying that he is releasing Fables into the public domain. Now, this caused a big furor online, particularly in the the tiny corner of the internet that I'm in. All the public domain people are like, "Whoa, Fables in the public domain." But it's kind of a minefield. DC came out a day later with their own statement saying that Bill Willingham can say anything he wants, but Fables is not in the public domain. You cannot publish Fables books, and if you do, we're going to sue you. And then Bill Willingham put out another statement to clarify. What he basically said was, you can't publish the DC Fable stories that are already out. So, you couldn't do a reprint collection of the DC issues of Fable because the contract, the rights don't cover that. But according to Bill Willingham, his stance is that you can make your own version of Fables based on his stories. So he's saying that the deal that he has with DC, he still has the intellectual rights, and that DC only has the rights to the material that they've already printed. And so if someone else wants to set their own story in the Fables universe, they're welcome to do that. Now, DC, again, they're pretty adamant that nobody's going to be allowed to do that. And so there's a lot of confusion right now as to what the status of Fables is whether or not the setting and the character ideas and stuff are in the public domain. The basic answer is I don't know. But that's true with a lot of stuff that's supposed to be in the public domain, because there's always sometimes it's clear cut, but a lot of times there's rights entanglements. And so there's a couple things specifically I wanted to talk about here. The first is just an understanding of the nuance of Bill Willingham's position, basically where he's saying you can't reprint or publish yourself the same stories that DC did, but you can do your own new stories. So when a character's in the public domain, anybody can use them. So let's take Dracula, for example. Anybody can use Dracula, right? Because Bram Stoker's Dracula, the original book, in the public domain. So anybody can do anything they want with that material. You can make your own version of Dracula. Anytime someone makes their own version of Dracula, their version of Dracula is copyright protected. So if let's say Marvel's version of Dracula. Now Marvel's version of Dracula has some specific story elements that some story elements that obviously are taken from the original material, but over the course of the 70 issues of Tomb of Dracula, he got all sorts of story specific things, continuity specific things. He has a specific look that the Marvel version has that's a little bit different from the other versions. So if you're going to do a Dracula, you can't use the stuff from the Marvel comics because their version of Dracula is copyrighted, right? So, and like the new characters that they've put in the mythos, like Rachel Van Helsing, copyright. You can't use those characters. So that's kind of how, where it becomes a gray area. Another example from my own work is Granny Gumshoe, who I mentioned before. So, Granny Gumshoe appeared in National Comics in 1947, appeared from issues 57 to 70. Quality Comics eventually sold their stable of stuff to DC, but there was a period where almost all, if not all of the stuff that they had printed, they didn't renew the copyrights. And so it's in the public domain. So with Granny Gumshoe, I've significantly changed the character. Everything I've done is based on how the elements from the original, but I made her much more steampunk. I sort of turned her personality dial up a bit. Because for me, she's kind of like a more sinister Mary Poppins, or kind of like Doctor Who, but with hints of the Master. So she's kind of like, and I gave her an airship, and like again, I tweaked her look some there, and so my version of Granny Gumshoe is copyright me. So you can't use my version of Granny Gumshoe if you're gonna make. But you can use the originals. So if you want to make your own version of Granny Gumshoe, you can do that. You just can't use mine. Here's where the real gray areas come in, particularly when it comes to Fables, is figuring out where those lines are. So as I mentioned, when I was using Granny Gumshoe, I was basing all of my changes on stuff that I see in the stories. There's specific story elements that influence all of the decisions I made when I was redesigning the character. So let's say someone else decides to do the same thing, and if they are inspired by the same story elements, they may end up with a character that's similar in ways to mine. This is where I think DC is going to have some trouble. Now, they're helped by the fact that they're a giant company with trillions of dollars. But they're going to have, I think, a little bit of difficulty enforcing things. Because, like the scenario I was just suggesting, one thing that makes the Fable stuff really tricky is that all of the Fable characters were originally public domain to begin with. When you think about the characters in the story, it's all characters from fairy tales. So it's like, Snow White and Rose Red and the Big Bad Wolf and Pinocchio and, all the characters, Bluebeard, whatever. They're all public domain characters. So it's not a situation like you would have if you tried to make your own Batman comic. You can't do it. But if you try and make your own story about characters from fairy tales, that say are stuck in the modern day living in a town among us and we don't know about it, you can definitely do that. All you have to do is look at the show Once Upon a Time, which according to what I read was actually stolen from a Fables pitch that Bill Willingham had made to ABC, and they decided they don't, just to cut out the middleman, because all the characters in the public domain, right? So that's where it's going to be, I think, very difficult for DC to actually enforce their copyright claims on some of this stuff, because you could very easily make characters that look similar to the characters in Fables, have the same names, have a very similar backstory, and they couldn't really do anything. Where it's, I think the only place you're really going to come into difficulty would be if you use the specific plots and story elements from Fables. So if you set your characters in the Fables continuity, then it would be a question of whether Bill Willingham is correct and he can do that, or whether DC is correct. And of course, the other place you're going to come into difficulty with is if you use the name Fables, particularly on the cover, because it's trademarked. And some of the specific characters, so like Big Bad Wolf, fine to use. Big B Wolf, a little bit different because that's specific to Fables. So, like, as soon as it was announced, there were creators that I know that were planning on doing Fables related stuff with Fables in the title of the comics, and that I think could get very dicey for trademark reasons, just setting aside the copyright reasons. So it's all very fascinating. It's very murky, but this is the sort of thing that creators like myself have to deal with. If you're going to be dealing with characters in the public domain, you have to be willing to do the research, but also there's a certain amount of risk involved with using some of these characters. Even Granny Gumshoe, DC has used almost all of the quality characters at one point or another. They've even put in trademarks on a bunch of them, on characters that they've never actually used. But as far as I could tell, they apparently thought Granny Gumshoe sucked because they never used her in anything or did a trademark or anything. Unlike some of the other really obscure quality characters that they did just in case they wanted to use them in the future, right? So it's fascinating. But there's other questions, that I'm not really going to get into, but I've heard some people debating, like, would you even want to put something in the Fables universe, because there's certain elements of the Fables story, things that Bill Willingham has put in, certain political positions that he's baked into some of the stories that are problematic or people really disagree with. And so, before you decide you're going to use Fables because it's cool, you may want to make sure you know what you're doing and getting into. But it's all very interesting. I mean, I read Fables up till issue 125. And I thought the first 75 issues, which is one complete story, was really good, and it kind of went off the rails after that. I wouldn't give it an A, but I would have given it probably a B, a solid B or a B+. So, when this announcement came out, my immediate thought was, oh, that sounds cool. What could I do with those characters that would fit in with what I'm doing? And there are some things that I could do. There's certain aspects of that would fit in with some of the stuff that I'm going to be doing in Crimebusters, or even, Cthulhu versus Uncle Sam. There's definitely some Venn diagram there between like a Lovecraft mythos and a fairy tale mythos. Like, you could easily sort of combine those two, but is it worth it to me to get involved in all of this potential legal difficulty? Probably not. I think you'd need to really be passionate about stuff. I mean, the good news is, because of how long it takes to make comics, by the time anyone would actually get to the point where they've got a comic done with Fables in it, we'll have a lot more information about legally what the status actually is, because at the time I'm recording this, it's only been a few days since the announcement. But it's super interesting. And when you think about all the creators that have had issues with Marvel and DC over the years, to have someone that has the creator-owned stuff basically take this stance. We've seen a lot of people sue Marvel and DC for characters that they claim, were shouldn't have been work for hire and stuff like that, and all blah blah blah. But this is a rare instance of someone who is, it's always been advertised as a creator-owned book, and so to sort of take this step and put it in the public domain to allow other creators to make their own versions of Fables, it's a really interesting creative exercise, but it's also an interesting attempt to sort of stick it in DC's eye, when maybe because his thing was he has these binding contracts with DC, but nobody else does. So he wanted to get it open, which significantly devalues potentially the brand for himself, but also for DC, which I think is his aim. So really interesting. Hopefully this has been interesting. I feel like I've been rambling a little bit. I'm not quite sure that I made all the points I was planning on, but something I'm going to keep an eye on for sure. And who knows, maybe, Bigby Wolf, I think, is sort of the breakout character of the series, and that's a character that I could definitely use in a couple stories that I'm working on. So, who knows? Anything's possible. But for now, I'm not really planning on using Fables, but I really hope other people do, because I'm really curious. Not even because I want to read the stories, but I just want to see what happens with it, because I think it'll be really interesting for indie creators. And people who like working with public domain stuff. So let me know what you think down below. And I'll see you next time.